You're listening to the Zen Cop Podcast.
Guys, welcome back. Mac Rollins, Zen Cop here. Thank you for listening and thank you for being here. This is season 2, episode 5. I'm super excited. This is the third installment of the California Dreamin series, and I'm super stoked to have Marlon Marrache. He is a former LAPD sergeant, now retired, and worked IA for many years. Don't worry, he knows I'm recording this, and I'm looking forward to talking with him about a lot of stuff. The issues within California, like we've been discussing with all of the guests on the California Dreamin series. Marlon is also the host of the Internal Affairs of Police podcast. Go ahead and give that a listen when you're done with this one. He's got some great guests with some wild stories. So, Marlon, thank you so much for being here. And for the audience who does not know, who is Marlon Marrache?
Mac, thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it. Oh, gosh. Trip down memory lane. Let's see. July of 2022, I retired with 24 years on with LAPD. And I got promoted to sergeant in 2007. And so I left as a sergeant 15 plus years as an LAPD sergeant. In that time as a sergeant is when I really started honing in on discipline. For whatever reason, it just kind of drew me into knowing about our disciplinary system more than anything. Talk about turning the clock back in the mid 90s. I was in the U.S. Navy in an aircraft carrier, and I actually prepared cases for court martials in JAGs, so I was around discipline then. You could imagine in an aircraft carrier of 5,000 plus sailors, I pretty much knew everybody's dirty laundry, and so you fast forward, that's why I bring it up, fast forward 25 plus years later, and here I am again in discipline as it relates to anything there is to know about misconduct. A big machine like LAPD happens to have, it's got its flaws. Not everything is perfect. And so I ended up working internal affairs for about 5 years. And the unique part about LAPD, it's the only agency in the entire United States that has a disciplinary system by which if you are brought up on serious allegations of misconduct, the chief of police says, look, I am directing you to this hearing, this tribunal hearing. It's called a Board of Rights. And I'm going to go ahead and recommend removal because it's that serious. However, I'm going to leave it up to this 3-panel member to pretty much determine your destiny. And so my job was a prosecuting glorified attorney representing the chief of police for LAPD going up against the defense. So you can imagine it's like a trial. So I spent about close to 5 years of doing that, about 30 plus of these hearings I had under my belt, and I can tell you it's an emotional roller coaster. I would also say that not many of the cases that we got were solid cases in terms of trying to prove preponderance, right? The standard of proof is preponderance. But for the most part, we spent a lot of time, we meaning myself, my colleague, the defense, and the board members, we spent a lot of time just wondering, what are we really doing here? And I'm being completely transparent to the point where a lot of what people perceive internal affairs to be is not what it is. Meaning, when you get alleged misconduct against an accused sworn officer, it's not always what it seems from the get-go, from intake all the way into adjudication. So I spent a lot of time getting to know that to the point where I teach this stuff now. So I got hired by Savage Training Group, by Scott Savage, to actually teach a 2-day post-certified course. And you know what? It's been, Mac, and been blessed, man. There's a lot to know. There's a lot to learn. We spent all of 2023. As a matter of fact, our first course was last March. And all of last year, we have spent just going around the state of California, up and down northern. We went to Central. We have a class coming up in Modesto next month. And a lot of these new sergeants is dear to me only because internal affairs gets a bad rap, and you know this, or anybody who's listening, that stigma has been around for so many decades that I decided to, you know what, let's make sure that no stone goes unturned when you decide to do this type of function, whether you want to do it or you're, what do they call that lately? Voluntold. Hey, Sarge, you're going to go to internal affairs. And you're like, well, that's not what I wanted to do. And so you're voluntold to go into this unit, and you got to prepare yourself to be an IO, an investigating officer. And we've been teaching new sergeants to do this. So that's a little bit of me. I did spent a year after I retired for only 4 months in a Cal State University system. I got a job offer as a promotion to lieutenant, which was second in command to the chief of police. So we pretty much ran a 23 sworn department in one of the Cal State universities. I did that for 1 year, and Mac, after a year, which was last November, I pretty much decided to resign and really hone in and focus on discipline and really help out the majority of people who really want to know about internal affairs, which is one of the reasons why we started this podcast. So yeah, that's pretty much a little wraparound, merry-go-round of my career.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and for the audience who doesn't know, internal affairs, I would, if I had to put it into a sentence, would be, they're the guys who are tasked with essentially policing their own and, keeping, I guess, tabs, or however you want to word it, on people who, may be, have misconduct or anything pending, essentially. But it does have a stigma that goes with it that is unfortunate, but at the same time, it's a job that somebody has to do. And if you get the wrong person in that job, that's when you start seeing some pretty catastrophic problems within an agency. And I think that a lot of people, if you're a cop, and I mean, at some point you're going to be in an IA, whether you're the subject or the witness, it's going to happen. And a very smart man who has since promoted, he was the IA sergeant for many years. And he told me one day that it's not my job to prove or find innocence or guilt. It's my job to find the truth. And the truth is whatever it may be.
That's right. It'll set you free. To your point, in my podcast, one of the first things that I ask, which I actually do in the classroom, is on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, why don't you go ahead and rate the importance of internal affairs in a police department? And you know what? You get a lot of different views, a lot of different lenses where people see, well, you know what? Patrol is the backbone, and, and it's not that important. One of my guests, and we've been doing episodes since November is when we launched the podcast. One of my guests says, you know what? I really like to defer on rating this, only because if you're talking about small agencies, well, you know what? Maybe perhaps it's not as important because there's probably not many IAs that are being initiated. But in a big machine like LAPD, LASD, the Sheriff's Department, and other departments in California, yeah, it's big. And to your point, you definitely want to choose someone that's going to be fair and impartial. You want to choose someone that's got some really good character, because one thing that I've realized is don't have any expectations when you do this job. And sometimes we do have that expectation. And what happens is that expectation manifests into bias. And so if I didn't like Mac while we were working, and next thing you know, I get promoted to sergeant and I get assigned to internal affairs, well, guess what? There's a complaint that just landed on my desk. I have an IA and it's Mac Rollins. Mm-hmm. Well, I know what kind of guy Mac is. And so I have these pre-notions or, this type of expectation that, oh, yeah. So very well said by your one of your bosses that your job is to get to the truth. And the other thing also, too, is you want to gather as much evidence as you can. So not only are you a fact finder, which if you want to really split hairs in terms of what is the duties and responsibilities of an investigator in internal affairs, it's not so much that you're finding facts. What you really are doing is you're gathering as much evidence as you can so that you can exonerate that officer. So there's a bit of protection in the fact that what you're doing in this job is to protect those good cops from those bad ones, because you and I both know there is bad apples. And you're right. At some point, you're going to get an IA, which me personally, I rated a 10, because no matter what type of police function you're deploying or you're applying, in the end, someone's going to do something that just didn't go the way it was supposed to. And next thing you know, well, I think you did something wrong, so let's just go ahead and get an IA. And so what we try to avoid is that knee-jerk reaction to say, well, do we really need to cut a face sheet, is what I call it. No, not really. Why don't we have a discussion about this before we start really getting into the fact that we want to do an IA on an officer? So, yeah, very good point.
I think a lot of people don't understand the totality of when you start that paperwork process. It becomes a permanent document, and that can be very nerve-wracking. And it can also, some agencies go through where everyone's just IA crazy. We're going to do an IA for everything, and large or small. And for the listeners who don't know, and for the public in general, I mean, this is just my takeaway. I would say that when it comes to, I don't know, almost 60% of the IAs that come across the desk of that supervisor, 60% of them are nothings. They're just a complete false complaint that can be resolved fairly quickly and with little legwork. And then there's that, other percentage that, yeah, the cop probably did something wrong, but there was no, I would say, intention or malice. It wasn't with intent. It was an accident. They screwed up. And then there's that other small fraction of a percent that is truly like criminal. And those are the ones that make headlines. That's what gets the attention. But I think the majority of what we go through as cops, the complaints are generally explainable, or they're just simply proved untrue with audio, body cam, whatever the case may be. But the internal damage that does to the employee can be catastrophic. And if we continue to, I don't want to use the word victimize, but accuse certain cops of doing something, everyone knows who's a cop, what that feels like. But for the people who have never been through it, going through an IA, when you know that you did nothing wrong, is extremely taxing mentally and physically. It does a lot of harm to the employee. And over time, if we abuse that, I think the employee, we will lose the employee eventually, whether it takes days, weeks, or months. But I think in time, that person is going to go, yeah, I can't do this anymore. I just can't.
Yeah, no, mental wellness, totally 100% important. I know that today, compared to my days back when I was working patrol, it was unheard of in terms of mental wellness. Meaning, yeah, if there's a catastrophic event like a officer-involved shooting, you take someone's life, by all means, that's going to have a major effect for the rest of your life. Suicide ideations or having a partner that committed suicide, those are just devastating tragedies that you experience. But what people don't really talk about a lot is the disciplinary process. To your point, it's an emotional roller coaster, especially when you didn't do something wrong. Or you tell yourself, you know what, this is what I was taught. This is what I was trained to do. Yeah, I deviated, and my deviations was substantial, but I can justify why I substantially deviated from these tactics that I was taught. And so what ends up happening is, they're putting blame for you doing your job, and it doesn't sit well with people. I've been a subject to a couple of IAs, and just before we move forward also, I've had the opportunity and the privilege to actually defend cops. So for all you who are listening out there, I know small agencies have union representatives. Well, in LAPD, we're so big, we actually had a whole unit called Officer Representation Section, and known as RRS. And in RRS, your primary duty is to roll out to all these critical incidents, OIS is being the most popular because that's what happens the most. And so the attorney only represents the shooting officer. And for a scenario, let's just say there's only one shooter. So attorney's job, they're getting paid for pretty much representing the actual shooting officer. Well, guess who's left with all the other precipient witnesses? It's a defense rep from RRS. And so I've rolled out to hundreds of these critical incidents, and we've had to represent and ensure that internal affairs doesn't violate their peace officers' Bill of Rights. Pre-body worn video, we did a lot of walkthroughs. So there's this whole process, and I've gained a lot of experience by representing officers as a primary duty in these critical incidents. But the secondary duty was you, Matt, come up to me and say, hey, Marlon, you know what? I just got this IA. I got skellied. I got served. And you know what? I didn't do this. The department's saying sustain, which means that it occurred. I'm telling you that I didn't do that. So how do we go from sustained to unfounded? And then you come to me, and one of the first things I'll tell you is, look, let's read this complaint with a fine-tooth comb from soup to nuts, A to Z, from face sheet to investigation, all the addenda items, all the evidence the department had to sustain these allegations. And then you got to ask yourself, if you did this, then there's not much that we can do in terms of appealing it. But if for whatever reason you say, no, that's not what I did, then yeah, come see me. We'll write a skelly or we'll do an admin appeal hearing, and we'll challenge the chief's decision. And so I did that for a couple of years, coupled with my 12 to 15 year. Well, I think I'm going probably now on 13 some plus years in discipline. So I got a pretty good balance on both sides of the table. So that's helped me out a lot. But in terms of the emotional roller coaster that you go through, it doesn't matter how minor of an alleged misconduct is. Once you are told that you have an IA on you, you know what? Your world changes, man. And what happens is that our leadership doesn't really, I wouldn't say they won't pay attention to that, but they just probably don't understand how it affects an individual, especially when you're faced with serious misconduct.
For sure. Yeah. It's when I was younger, probably my first year, I was involved in a pretty big one as the subject. It ended up being a nothing. It wasn't anyone's fault, just kind of a go nowhere. But the amount of anxiety that I felt was, I mean, as a new guy, and the sergeant at the time was like, hey, this is just sort of a paperwork process. It's not a big deal. But I remember thinking, my God, this is the scariest thing I've ever, because they basically tell you could get fired. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to get fired. And the senior guys are telling you, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. But I mean, I don't know that. I don't know how serious or not serious this is. And, I had a couple of, as a witness for a few of them, the good ones will, before the recorder goes on, they're going to tell you, hey, just relax. This is going to be okay.
Right.
This will probably be a nothing, and just get through it. Tell me the truth. Tell me what happened, and we'll be fine. And I think that communication and the just transparency is really helpful. And I have friends who work for other agencies, and the processes are so different. I took an OIS class a couple of years ago, and they talked about LAPD and how unique it was for their process. So for the audience who doesn't know, or they're not familiar, would you mind just kind of telling or explaining, I guess, how the IA process, and including Skelly, how all that works from beginning to end, ultimately, if it's, disciplinary or non-disciplinary, but maybe just take the audience through that process.
Yeah, absolutely. So Force Investigation Division, which is part of Internal Affairs, you have teams of experienced detectives, investigators, who actually roll out the minute they get notified, when the trigger is pulled, and hey, when you're going to make notifications. Once the situation is not hot, then they begin to start setting everything up and investigating. Now, you got to understand, we love to just cast a really wide net, which is good. You should cast a wide net, and then kind of work yourself, or I should say, work it all the way in to see what you really need in terms of the facts known of this particular OIS. And so, as you may know, or if you don't know, the first thing, if you are the actual shooting officer, you have to give a public safety statement. You have to let the first sergeant at scene known, is what we call the PSS, the public safety statement. And he's going to ask you a series of questions. I think it's like 9 questions, and they're basic questions by which they have to pretty much do. And they're ordering you to do so. It's not voluntary, and you can't ask for representation when they're asking you which direction did you shoot, how many rounds did you fire, are there any outstanding suspects, et cetera, et cetera. Those are questions as it relates to the safety of the public. Depending on the circumstances, there's a strong possibility that the rounds that you fired could be in jeopardy, wherever they may be. So that's the reasoning behind it. So after that PSS is done, you're supposed to monitor and separate as many involved, or I should say, substantially involved uh, sworn personnel at the scene of an OIS. So once that's done, hey, who here saw it? Well, I was here also. Okay, then you come over here. You're going to be monitored and separated from the shooting. And let's just say there's actually two shooting officers. Well, they have to be separated and monitored. And here they go. They start setting up their perimeter. Investigators come and they start trying to gather as much evidence. The good thing about police work today is with body-worn video, you actually have the opportunity to pretty much start watching the actual shooting officer's video. And that particular video, for the most part, not in every circumstance, it'll depict the positioning and pretty much kind of like the circumstances to give you an idea as to what really happened prior to pulling the trigger and obviously after you pull the trigger. And so that kind of streamlines a lot of the duties and responsibilities from all these investigators from Force Investigation Division to come investigate this critical incident. Now, as a sergeant, if you're listening, when you get to the scene of an OIS, the first thing you want to do is definitely to get the PSS, turn it off. There has been, and we do this in class too, in Savage Training Group with my partner. I have a co-instructor. He's a sergeant from San Francisco PD who is part of a rollout OIS team. We create a little bit of a controversy where we say, hey, do you do the PSS with the body-worn video on, or do you do it off? And depending if you have a policy or not, you follow your department's policy. Me personally, turn it off. Again, we're here to ask these particular questions. People want to know what happened, and let's move on. And so that's part of your duties as a sergeant. Now, the other thing too is you got to start grabbing body-worn video from what you believe are the substantially involved. Because once you start gathering all this body-worn video, again, it's going to depict a lot of what happened prior and post, and it's going to make everybody's job a little bit more flexible and reasonable as it relates to time. Now, in a big agency like LAPD, the chief wants to know within 72 hours what happened, which in some agencies, they don't. Some agencies don't have that policy. What that creates is the investigators having to tell the defense attorney, or I should say the representing attorney of the shooting officer, like, yeah, we have to get a statement. We have to get some basic statement. Well, nowadays, if you start talking about sleep deprivation, might be an issue. Maybe you don't want to give a statement. Or what if the officer's injured? What if he shot a couple of rounds and he ends up being at the hospital because he got shot at by the suspect? Well, again, these are all circumstances that you have to take in consideration. But there is a lot of agencies that don't really have that kind of policy from the chief. Like, hey, maybe we can just give a soundbite that's kind of general, that kind of tells us a story, but we don't need to really hear what the officer, said, what was going on right before he pulled the trigger. So those are some basics as it relates to rolling out to an OIS. And then once you gather all the percipient witnesses substantially involved, then you start scheduling all these interviews, compelled interviews with your defense rep or union rep, et cetera, et cetera. Now, keep in mind, that's a big machine, and we're very detailed and very meticulous as what we do. And we're going to ask you questions frame by frame, second by second. Another position, if you will, that we take is we meaning LAPD, we make sure that the shooting officer and all substantially involved percipient witnesses watch video. And you're going to watch video as much as you want. You can scrub it. You can go back and forth. Everything that you need to know before we walk into that compelled interview with internal affairs. Now, there is some agencies that don't want to go by what they consider the corrupt mind. And there's a lot of studies out there. Force Science has huge studies about perception versus the corrupt mind, et cetera, et cetera. But you know what? That's the way I was taught. That's what I've seen. I can tell you, Mac, that if you're watching body worn video, you're not, in my experience, there's nothing corrupt about the fact that you really want to know how this really all went down. It's more of a performance like, wow, I can't believe this happened. Because you and I both know, and whoever's listening is, I mean, come on, the average OIS is what, less than 2 seconds? Or something along those lines, right? I mean, it happens that quick. And the decision making and then the reaction time is just something that you're left with, like, oh shit, I really want to know how this all happened. And the emotions are just flying sky high and down, and you're wondering, and so it's got a lot of trauma involved too, afterwards, because sometimes you feel like you did the right thing, and nowadays another reasoning that, in my opinion, to watch a lot of body worn video, because in the state of here in the Los Angeles County, as you may know, the district attorney, and I think this is not just our district attorney, I think just in the state of California, look, if you got into an OIS 10 years ago, especially with a man with a knife or that type of a weapon, what chances are you might have substantially deviated. You might have had your reasonings, and you'll be clear to be in policy. But nowadays, good luck. You're looking at criminal filings. And that is the honest truth. That's reality. You want to come on this job, you need to know that the reality is that there could be, depending on your actions, some criminal liability on your part.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that I think there's a huge disconnect between. I started in 2010, so I feel like I still got a taste of what things were like pre Prop 47, pre everything for the most part. I got 5 or 6 years under my belt.
Pre body worn video. Yeah, 2015
I was able to still be a cop. Yeah, and it's crazy because de-escalation, or whatever we want to label it these days, sometimes that comes at 900 feet per second, and that's the way it is. And de-escalation is eliminating a threat. It's the threat to the public, whatever it may be. I feel like as of late, there's been far less shootings, but that's not a good thing. I know some people will go, "What do you mean? What do you mean?" Well, there are scenarios where the public has gotten hurt, the bad guy absconded, whatever the case may be, in a scenario where I think the newer generation is afraid to use force, even when it's justified, even when it's completely 100% within policy. I've heard stories and seen the videos where you're just kind of watching it going, what are you doing? Why? And that person, it's ultimately their decision to make. And I'm not encouraging someone to just, be careless when it comes to lethal force, but I feel like there's been some more recent cop-related death and a lot of cop-related injury for people who are afraid to use force at all, whether it be lethal, less lethal. And for the audience to understand, the IA umbrella covers the OIS aspect as probably the biggest deal, any critical incident, in custody death, whatever it is. But you guys also manage the internal workings of problems that are simple, low-lying, complaint all the way up to, the OIS stuff. But some of the internal stuff that deals with use of force, and not lethal force, but just use of force, that can also be a huge, huge number where officers are accused of misconduct, even when the scenario presents as totally within policy. But like you mentioned, there is sometimes some civil litigation. There's all kinds of things that can come up now. Is that something that you're seeing as well now, even being out of the system, but maybe in your trainings and talking to younger cops on the street nowadays?
Oh, no, absolutely. I think that, I suppose the best way to kind of make sure that we get a really good message out to the audience is that, look, don't be hesitant to do what you feel is right. I think the big challenge in law enforcement is training. And I echo my boss, Scott Savage, with Savage Training Group, a lot, with the fact that this death by PowerPoint and this check the box, it's just not cutting it. Take me, for example. In the academy, I didn't know anything about Peace Officers' Bill of Rights. know anything about IA. I suppose you never know anything about IA until you actually get an IA. I would say in 2010, Mac, when you came on, even though probably somebody had a couple of blocks of instruction for like what, maybe 1 or 2 hours, maybe your union came in and said, hey, let me tell you a little bit about, internal affairs, or maybe you didn't even know what the definition of misconduct is. And so what happens is that you're just, you're chasing the radio, man, and you're working. And nowadays it's just a really bad recipe. We are completely undermanned. We don't have uh, uh, a really positive image to say, hey, come on the job, meaning it's hard to get people to get into this type of career, this type of profession. And so you're left with what?
Yeah.
You're left with what you have now in every agency. And now there's a lot of agencies that are mandating overtime. So now that I'm asking you to work more overtime, so now you're looking at 6, 7 days a week. You're away from your family. And where do you find the time to actually train? 2020, AB 392 came out, which revamped the entire 835 APC. And if you're listening out there, you need to go Google 835 APC and really know what 835 APC is, which is what I consider to be the Bible. It is the manifest of your use of force policy. And in that AB 392, when they changed it all, is things like de-escalation, is all the circumstances that led up before you actually pull the trigger, totality of the circumstances, hey, v San Diego. And then last but not least, when you talk about lethal force, they use the buzzword imminent, and that word imminent is broken down in a major analysis. And so don't be so hesitant to learn all this, because you got to work with what the law is giving you. So police work hasn't changed. And I tip my hat off to the state of California to say, okay, look, I understand that a lot of these critical incidents are ugly and they don't look great, but let's have the ability to at least let me know what you were thinking. But before you actually tell me what you were thinking, what you actually did, and articulate it in a way that, okay, it makes sense in your mind. But the problem is that we organizations, law enforcement organizations, do a disservice to our officers because we're just not teaching this stuff. And that's part of the problem. Now, going back to uses of forces, and forget about just lethal force for a while. Yeah, now from an internal affairs lens, you got to be careful with statute of limitation issues. I'll give you an example. You and I, on Monday, get into a use of force, right? And everybody says, you know what, Marlon Mack, you're good to go. You're okay. You're okay. That's Monday in February. However, someone probably said, hey, you know what? I heard, they were looking at this use of force. He was a little, he went to the hospital and, it doesn't look great. Let's just say, for the purposes of this scenario, the suspect arrestee didn't even call the station, didn't make a complaint, didn't do anything. And so what happens is that about 6, 7 months later, someone up in the levels of review decides to review this particular incident and say, oh, no, you know what? What they did, the type of force or the type of tactic that they applied, you know what? That doesn't look right. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and cut an IA and let them know. Well, now you're at the 7th, 8th mark. So good luck. You better do all this in 4 months. Or we can argue, right? I would argue, well, wait a minute, hold on a second. When it went down in February, yeah, someone documented that perhaps, they did deviate a little bit from what they were taught. And okay, well, if you take more than 4 months in this particular scenario to serve me and say that, hey, you use unauthorized tactics, well, our argument's going to be, well, in February, someone already mentioned and someone already knew the uninvolved supervisor was aware of alleged misconduct. And here's the email, or here's the conversation, or here's the text. And therefore, you have violated statute. It's past statute, so there's nothing that you can do. It's a lens from IA that not many are familiar with, because the first thing you do when you get to internal affairs, what you should be looking at is the statute of limitations. 3304 specifically says that you have 1 year from the date of the uninvolved supervisor that is aware of misconduct for you to be serving Skelly. If it's past that 1 year statute, guess what? You cannot impose any penalty. You can frame the allegations and you can adjudicate it, sustain, not sustain, exonerate it, whatever the case may be. But what you cannot do is impose penalty.
For the audience who doesn't know, can you describe Skelly real quick?
Yes. So Dr. Skelly, hopefully the audience can come take one of my classes.
Yeah.
Dr. Skelly is actually, he was a doctor. Not many people know that. He was a state employee who showed up to work drunk and late all the time. And so they finally said, you know what, we're getting rid of you. And so they fired him. He said, well, wait a minute, don't you kind of have to let me know or give me some documentation or give me the reasoning as to why is it that you actually terminated me? And so that particular case ended up all the way to the California Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, you know what? You're absolutely right. You need to be served with everything that the department used, every evidence, the entire investigation to be given to you and give you an opportunity to respond. Normally, I shouldn't say normally, generally, it's a 30-day response, depending on the statute date. So what they ended up doing is they gave him his job back and they said, okay, cool, we'll give you your job back. But 2 months later, he ended up getting terminated and they gave him everything as to the reasons why. So people use Skelly. People also use other terms in terms of being served. But the Skelly process is pretty much having your command staff or whoever is representing the chief of police to sit you down and tell you, hey, Mac, hey, Marlon, here is the entire investigation. Here are the addenda items. Here's all the audio, all the interviews, all the evidence that we use to determine this particular complaint investigation from internal affairs. And we're giving you an opportunity to actually respond.
Yeah. We're getting into the topic of California, which is why I have you on. And
yes,
kind of diving into, I guess, if you had to pick one, whether it's SB1, if there was something that every cop in California should be aware of that they're not, or maybe they heard little bits and pieces about it, what is something, especially with the upcoming year, what is something they should be paying attention to?
Oh, I'm going to have to pick SB2. Senate Bill 2. Senate Bill 2 came into effect last year, 2023. What I do know about Senate Bill 2 is pretty much the process by which you can be decertified or be revoked of your post certificate, basically your license. So the state is pretty much saying, which is post, that if you commit any of these 9 serious misconduct defined, and you can look them up, we're not going to go through every single one of them, but I can tell you a couple: dishonesty. There's one labeled as sexual assault that has a whole different meaning, and there's a whole bunch of different ones. Use of force and OIS.
And the sex assault one, I think that's just like sex on duty overall, even if it's for pretty broad brush. Not that I'm encouraging that, but
exactly, which is kind of interesting, because when we actually do the Senate Bill 2 block of instruction in our Savage Training Group course, we divide the class in groups and we assign each group to do a teach back, to actually get in front of everybody and say, okay, you have definitions 1 through 3. The next group has definitions 4 through 6, and then the other group has 7 through 9. And then the other group's going to tell me about notifications, and then the other group's going to tell me about the advisory board. And so there's just a lot of moving parts. What we don't know, and what's a little bit challenging, and I wouldn't say so much frustrating, is that as an instructor, it's kind of like just being the messenger and you're just having this conversation about what this really is, because we don't know. What I can tell you is the advisory board of 9 members has been comprised, and you can look it up, what type of members they are. I can tell you it favored more of the civilian than it did the sworn, because I think it's 5 where they have to have a family member that was involved in that lost a life in an officer-involved shooting, and other community type of members. But anyhow, the first advisory board is about to go down. I want to say hopefully within the next 60 to 90 days, and I will be there to actually witness it, to see how this, I suppose, this kangaroo court, if you will, actually goes down. So that's one component. But yes, definitely look up Senate Bill 2. There is 9 definitions of serious misconduct. It's something that you need to know, because here's the deal. You get cleared in a critical incident like an OIS, some agencies have to report that to post. So even though you've been completely exonerated, you still have to wait to see what's going to happen with the SB2 process. The crappy part about this, which I feel is very where we are at a disadvantage, we meaning law enforcement officers, is that they decided to actually tell all the agencies in the state of California, send us everything that every single allegation that meets these 9 definitions of serious misconduct. Me personally, what they should have done is, look, if you have a sustained complaint that meets this criteria, then go ahead and send it in. Because yes, I don't think I want someone who lied. I don't think that's someone who committed all these felonies, if you will, to be having a license, And so that's part of the disadvantage that we have, because they're just completely boggled. I think the last time, I think the list is close to 100 now. It used to be like 70. You can look it up on the on posts of the people who are on the list, ready to face the advisory board and go through this whole process. But yeah, man, you got to know Senate Bill 2. That's super, super, super important. We don't know how it's going to be rolled out. So yeah, definitely. Bro.
So that's going to be all. So sustained, for people who don't know, sustained essentially means that, there was, you were found essentially that you did something wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're asking for everything, not just sustained, but everything. So even to include the ones where the cop did nothing wrong, they were found to be in the clear, but the allegations were XYZ.
Exactly. But they're completely boggled. They actually have a representative only for Los Angeles Sheriff's Department and the LAPD. I can tell you, because I still have my connections with LAPD, 20,000 cases.
Wow.
And then we can get it that already been referred. And here's the deal. And part of those 9 definitions of serious misconduct, there's actually 3 that are retroactive that can go back before 2020. And I don't want to get too much into it, but one of those has been OIS. Can you imagine getting a letter or being called to the watch commander's office and say, hey, you know what, Mac, Marlon, dude, you guys were in OIS 15 years ago. And I just got this letter from Post saying that you guys are being reviewed for revocation. And by the way, it's not just revocation, but it's also suspension. We just don't know. We don't know if they're going to revoke your license or they're going to actually suspend it. And if the suspension is going to last how many years. I think there's a max of 3 or something along those lines. But it's being rolled out, and it's super, super important.
It's strange because I look back at 2020, Derek Chauvin, George Floyd, and in that year, the chaos that ensued, but the aftermath, what we're dealing with, we still are dealing with it, but for the last probably the first year or two afterward, we lost all of these good candidates, all of these guys and girls who said, I want to be a cop. We watched them just quietly say, you know what, I'm going to pull my app. I want to do something else. And in hindsight, we ended up hiring a lot more Derek Chauvins, could be Derek Chauvins. And in that process, we created so much more liability. I don't think the public understands that we lost a lot of good cops that were already on the job, and we lost a lot of prospective awesome cops who would be the opposite of that. And now with the current, hiring pool, it's not just my agency, but everywhere is sort of being forced to lower the standards to say, okay, we need bodies, we need boots on the ground. And if we don't have them, well, we don't really have a choice. We have to hire someone. And so now we're introducing these subpar employees that probably would have been told thanks, but no thanks, try again in a couple of years, whatever, not necessarily DQ stuff, but just life experience, whatever it is. And now we're being forced to offer them a job, creating this this, potential atom bomb that's going to go off, who knows where. And, I just think it's a matter of time before we see that again. Sadly, I don't think the public understands that process, unfortunately.
Yeah. And speaking of the public, another thing it's a bit of a misconception is that, look, when we're talking about internal affairs, let's just make sure that we're talking about a really small fraction. I know you mentioned in the beginning of our conversation about how small of a fraction is. And you have to understand, in an agency like LAPD of 9,000 plus, I'm not even talking about 1%. Look, at these border rights hearings, when I was there from 2011 to 2015, I mean, we averaged close to 100. But out of the 100, a couple of them were opted, meaning you had the option. So you and I were offered a 15-day suspension, and we're like, this is not cool. This is not what happened. We have an option to go to this hearing. And so those were half. So 50 plus of those were directed by the chief of police saying you are facing termination. So if you really look at the big picture in terms of numbers, that's like 0.0000 like 5%. And in the podcast as well is I'm always careful, and I definitely emphasize that when we start having these conversations about internal affairs, and it's a bit taboo. No one wants to talk about, what happened, especially the accused. Like if I have a guest who's pretty much been put through the ringer, and let's just say there is some accountability on his or her part. Great. What are the lessons learned? Let's get some takeaways. But if the accountability is on the department because they got it wrong, that's reality. And sometimes it happens. Believe it or not, it happens more often than not. That's the problem. But to your point, all these good officers, and this is what you're saying, is that they actually left this profession. It's because they don't want to be painted with that brush. When Derek Chauvin happened, when Ferguson happened, when Kenosha happened, all these incidents, I had John Madeleine from Louisville with the Breonna Taylor case. He was one of my guests. It was a trifecta. He was like the third incident within that 2020, within that year. It was just a bad year for law enforcement. But here's the deal. There's over 18,000 agencies in the United States. And what we're talking about is agencies that you and I have never heard of. I didn't even know where Kenosha was or Ferguson was. Yeah, and so what happens is when you send that message out to the masses, and you sensationalize all these bad incidents, it paints all of us that we're just like these monsters. We're bad people. And that's if I came on this job to do good work and to take care of and protect and serve, I'm not going to want to do this when you start calling me evil. I think at one point we were called agents of racial genocide. Really?
Something like that.
Killers. And you know this. And so what happens is that no one wants to talk about when I say someone's life. No, they don't want to talk about that. No. And so it creates this narrative that we're all bad. And that's not the case. And I just want to make sure and be clear that whoever's listening is that when we are talking about, even in a small agency, let's just say you have an agency of 80 sworn officers. Look, if you have one or two that are bad apples, guess what? There's only two of them. And we do a very good job to weed those two out. But let's not paint those two to represent all the other 78, if you will. That's my point.
A pretty common thing where we have, you mentioned Breonna Taylor. I think if most people knew, the circumstances were unfortunate, but if people knew the fine print or even just normal size print that people didn't read. And I know that I can't remember who shared it, but even on social media, if you attempted to share it, Facebook would actually block it based on the verbiage and stuff like that. Yeah. But when that was said and done, suddenly you have this, oh, no knock warrant, no this, no. And that stuff's been going on for decades. And it only becomes a problem when we have this one incident and an incident that was completely covered and broadcasted completely inaccurately. But now once it's on the mainstream media, it's gospel now. They saw it, they read it, they saw it on whatever news channel. And so now it's just fact. And the majority of, I think, the critical incidents that we've been through as a country, they've happened a lot more than people would would probably care to believe. It's just a
Mhm.
matter of it catching the right, was it filmed at the right time and then
Yes.
put on the news? I mean, for me, I'm up here in Northern California. Stephon Clark was a huge big deal. But if
Mhm.
they read they actually published the text message threads. The DA did a great job, and
Mhm.
those cops ultimately used lethal force. It was justified, and their lives changed forever.
Of course.
A variety of things changed for our county and city locally, but at the end of the day, it's kind of funny how we can pick certain things apart, or the public will. And
Mhm.
like you said, having the internal knowledge of what the IA office will do for you long term, I think most cops, newer cops, should really hammer case law and the internal workings, peace officer bill of rights, all these things that you don't know about, but then when it finally comes time to
Yeah.
face the music, you're going to wish you devoted
Yeah.
months of studying
Sometime.
before you go up against that.
Yeah, and Pobar's been around. Peace Officer Bill of Rights been around since the 70s. And it was
Yeah.
created by the two major unions. So it was us, LAPD, and the sheriffs. And you can imagine back in the 70s, talk about corruption. Someone told me there was
Yeah.
an episode in Dragnet. Imagine Dragnet back in the 40s that talks about
Yeah.
the corrupt department and how internal
Oh
affairs.
yeah. It
So
happened
this
in
has
the
been going
20s.
on
It
for
happened in the
decades.
50s. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And the funny part is now we have this tech aspect that is pretty powerful. When I at my agency, we had these car cameras that were pretty shitty, but then we got these really neat new ones that had the audio attached to it. It was really intense, and everyone was freaking out. They're like, "Oh my god, this is going to be horrible. We're going to get in trouble." I laugh because to this day, those cameras saved our asses more than anything else that was out there. And it exonerated so many issues that would probably have gone IA full tilt. These are
Oh,
the
absolutely.
accusations, but no, I can sit down and push play and I can tell Joe Blow on the phone, I'm watching the video right now. This did not happen. And then they kind of, okay, well, I'm sorry, and hang up. Or there was a cop in Florida a couple years ago, maybe longer now, but state trooper guy pulls over this lady. She's hammered. He takes her for DUI, and she claims that he raped him on the way to the jail. And it made national headlines very, very quickly. And
Yeah.
all they did was watch the body cam, and it was completely untrue. The whole thing was
Oh,
made
yeah.
up. And unfortunately, if you still Google his name, it comes up as he's this rape suspect. But the woman who made these allegations, I mean, I couldn't tell you who she was because they didn't talk about it. So
Yeah.
it is unfortunate, but it's also nice to have that tech, sort of protection. And even for the people who do make mistakes, like I really can't hammer this enough. And you touched on it, to where even when a cop does screw up, 9 times out of 10, it's not with intention. It was a mistake that was made. And I get it.
Correct.
Some mistakes are horrible, but it doesn't make them this evil person. That's very, very rare when you have
Mhm.
illegal activity occurring within this community. It's actually, like you said, fractions of a percent. And the majority of those cops, though, they are held accountable, and the majority of them go, oh my god, I screwed up big time. I made a
Yes.
mistake. And even if it's where it involves, I don't know, pick your topic of, driving recklessly and hitting another car, killing someone. It sucks, but if we can repair it and fix it and keep that good
Yeah.
cop and fix the mistake. I know that's kind of a harsh way of looking at it, and I'm not trying to downplay human life, but that's the job that we live day in and day out. And there's not very many career fields where that's on the table
Oh,
for
no,
the
absolutely.
employee.
Very well said. What I will add to all that is, in my experience, and hopefully your audience can get a more of a clear picture about discipline or misconduct, is if you do something on duty, for the most part, the department's pretty flexible. On duty conduct, or let's just pick use of force for that matter. When you start talking about policy violations, procedures, neglect of duty, you fail to do this, you fail to do that. There's a lot of flexibility. There's some forgiveness. To your point, let's fix this and make sure you don't do it again. But when you start talking about off duty conduct, that's when the scope really gets super, super narrow. It gets very micro. And yeah, man, your destiny lies on that investigation, and they're going to pass judgment, and you're going to be scrutinized, and there's a strong possibility you might lose your job for whatever it is that you did off duty, because that's where it
Yeah.
really matters the most. And I just want to make sure we really convey that message. Keep doing what you're doing. apply force to the best of your abilities. There's a strong possibility that you might deviate. And guess what? Sometimes you'll deviate substantially, but more than anything, if you can justify those deviations, then you should be good to go.
Yeah, I tell people it's a lot like getting a ticket, speeding ticket, whatever it is. You can go to court and you can say guilty, not guilty, or guilty with an explanation. And 9 times out of 10, it's I screwed up, but I can explain why. Here's why I know I made a mistake, and
Yeah.
I can fix it. I can go through training, what have you. It just becomes one of those issues where if it's redundant, okay, well then we have to look at this a little more carefully. And I think if most people understood that there's such a huge checks and balances system within all of the agencies, especially in California, and I think as a California resident for 38 years, there's a high level of standard for training, for accountability. And it's kind of funny. You look at those major sort of critical incidents that have changed the course of history. They're oddly enough in this same little portion of the US where you could just kind of draw a circle and go, okay, well, do we have a training issue out here? And I started diving into it, and most of those academies are 90 days. They're maybe a couple months. Not a lot of training. You're on the road. In California, we're some of the most trained cops in existence, and we still need more training.
Yeah.
I mean, I can think of 10 different things that I go, yep, we should do more of this, but we can't because of time, money, whatever it may be. And at the same time, now that our hands are being tied figuratively with what we can and can't do, even something simple as the carotid, a maneuver that is life-saving, in my opinion. And now it's gone.
It's gone.
That tool is removed from our belt. And so what are we left with? I don't know, but it's not going to be good. So many things get a bad rap because one person screwed it up, or some political pundit or talking head decided to make it into a speaking point because they're running for office or whatever it is. It's always this game. And in the realm of public safety, we can't play games. We have to do things the right way. And being a cop and working in any type of public service aspect, especially for cops, it's just not pretty. The job that we have to do is not necessarily going to be easy, because the nexus of it is going to be negative. We're going to something somewhere because someone's doing something horrible to somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it sucks, but there's only so many ways you can deal with someone who is telling you no. And it's like, okay, well, the old saying of I'm going to ask you, I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to make you. And that mentality and mindset, I think, is not being either taught or shared with this new group of, I call them kids because they're younger than us, but they're just hitting the road, kind of just going, it's wild.
You were taught ATM. I was taught ATD, ask, tell, and do. Ask, tell, and make.
Yeah.
That was the way to do it. And for the most part, we've learned and we've grown. And I have absolutely no problem with de-escalation. And I want to touch on the research where you dove really deep into those incidents that happened in the small pocket in the United States. I always refer to that as organizational culture. It's cop culture, and I say this, and I'm going to say this until I get out of this business, is cop culture will always dictate what you do and what you don't do. And for the most part, it's what you don't do. And this, we get scrutinized and criticized for what you didn't do more than what you did. That's just the nature of the business. And so I'm a true believer, incidents like what happened in Memphis and even these landmark historical incidents that changed the perception of law enforcement has a lot to do with culture. Look, man, if this is what you guys do and I'm new and I'm here and this is what I'm being taught, then so be it. And if the sergeant turns a blind eye, if the lieutenant decides to turn a blind eye, all the way up the chain, the captain, the commander, the deputy chief, assistant chief, all the way to the chief, or however many levels of command staff you have, then guess what? That's how you do police work. But again, let's put things in perspective. There's 18,000 agencies. So what I'm trying to tell you, the audience, is that there's a lot of work that we have to do. And we're getting there. We're doing it. Unfortunately, sometimes it's at a snail pace, but it goes back to the, to training and to ensure that what you need to work with when you have to abide by the parameters of these rules.
Yeah. In California specifically, would you say, just sort of looking at the big picture from when you started till now, considering the mandates, the trainings, all that we
Mhm.
have, do you think that we are going to see an increase or a decrease in, I guess, not necessarily use of force, but mistakes being made, whether intentional or unintentional? Do you see that becoming a larger issue for California cops in the future?
Ooh, good question. Very complex and extremely challenging to be a police officer in the state of California today, and certainly a sergeant, because there's a lot that you have to know. Whether the uses of forces will decrease or increase, I would say because of the perception, it has decreased completely. I mean, one of my best friend has 27, 28 years on. He's worked patrol his entire career, and I talk to him every day. He's a sergeant out in patrol, and there is no observation work. These officers are out there. If they get a radio call, then that's your job. You got to go. So there's not much proactivity, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, yeah, that decreases uses of forces. How I see the future, well, if you know the rules and the regulations by which you need to work with in terms of using force, yeah, I suppose it could increase, but we're asking a lot. We're asking so much uh, to do. We're asking you to be, deal with the mental, illness type of radio call, or it just there's just a lot. But I think we have these rules and we have these new regulations to make us better. I'm all for growing and making us better, but in my opinion, I would say probably decrease more than it is increase. And when I say that, I'm specifically focusing in on critical incidents. I
Sure.
think the more
And I
that you
think people,
study and if you're more studious and know the law, especially AB 392,
yeah.
835 APC, there's a really, really strong possibility that we might see the numbers decrease.
Yeah, I think then for people who don't know, use of force for some agencies is it's putting on handcuffs. It can be drawing your gun. There's all
Yeah.
kinds of underlying sort of small print uses of force, and that can be. I don't like that we're creating a broad brush because, in my opinion, it sounds good to the public. Oh, we have all these use of force documentations and all this other stuff, and even like stop data. I think stop data
Yeah.
has decreased traffic stops because the cops don't want to deal with the work that comes with a traffic stop and having to input the data, because that's just one more thing for you to do, and it's
Right.
going to decrease. I think you use the P word, proactivity. I think is through the floor because we have this new group that doesn't want to do the work, or we have cops who are they're becoming cops for the wrong reasons. Either it's
Hmm.
again, kind of the bottom of the barrel pickings that we're going to get, but
Yeah.
I feel like that it's not just my agency, but everywhere where the majority of patrol is sort of just going, okay, cool. I'm going to wait for that call. I'm going to go and I'm going to go right back to my spot. We're going to hook up and chat till the next call goes off. And
Yeah.
proactivity is the basis of society being safe. I mean, if you can we're never going to be able to kill crime, but we can keep a firm grasp on the throat of it, making it difficult for it to thrive. And that's sort of the part that I think is being lost. And in turn, like you said, yeah, we're going to see a drastic decrease in use of force because no one's doing their job. And again, for the audience, use of force is not a bad thing. It sounds bad, but use of force can be subduing someone into custody that needs to go to jail. It can be, going hands on with, like you said,
Yeah.
someone who's having a mental crisis. They have to go to the hospital because they tried to jump off a bridge. We have to use force to take them into custody. And it's not always pretty. But when you start having cops afraid to do anything, you have a combination of chaos and victimization, and it's horrible because it's not just bad guys. There's so many other calls that we go to throughout the day and night that will dictate public safety to some degree. So I agree with
Yeah.
you that
Absolutely.
there will be a decrease.
Yeah. And so the audience knows absolutely. So the golden Bible of the standard rule of 835A that you learned and I learned were just those three prongs: overcome resistance, I should say, prevent an escape, and effect an arrest. That would always be, that should always be in the back of your mind. If you're listening and you're applying, just think of those three things: overcoming resistance, preventing an escape, and effecting an arrest. However, you need to go read AB 392 because there's more to it than that. It's completely changed. And so now, which is good because it's going to make you think whether or not you should actually use lethal force, one, I should say deadly force, or two, if it doesn't fall within those prongs, and like to your point, de-escalation is not part of 835 APC. Totality of circumstances is also part of 835 APC. So all these things are making you think, which is good. For what? For you to prevent to use force. And yeah, and as it relates to traffic stops, absolutely. Remember our days, dope money guns. When have you not had a traffic stop when you know there's a potential of, of a lot of, what we call a good hook? Someone's there transporting all these guns, all these drugs, and they can be very dangerous, and that creates the potential of a use of force. But since we don't do them as often, you can see the decrease there for sure.
Yeah, and the bad guy knows. You brought up sergeants, and it's kind of neat. We're talking about the sort of the beat cop aspect, but for the newer sergeants or anyone, I don't care if you're new or old, but in my opinion, it's your job to know and pretty much have memorized a lot of the stuff that we're talking about to where you can help your employee. I don't want to use the word protect, but help, and to show them, through training and through your own proactivity that, I can do this because here's this case law. Case law is great. If you know case law, your shift will be so much easier when it comes to your confidence, your ability to say, yes, absolutely, I can do this. Here's why. But also the protection of, 835 and all the other things that we're supposed to know. It's on the supervisor to, in a briefing, hey guys, we're going to take 20 minutes and just go over this real quick. We're going to touch on this. And I have a YouTube video we could watch. And I was on weekend graves for a long time when I was new, and weekend graves, we went through sergeants like underwear. So it was just all the new guys coming through. But a lot of them that promoted later, kind of the older guys, they came in with this insight that was just so powerful, so good. And their whole thing was just, my job is to prevent you from getting in trouble, getting hurt, or getting killed. And that's my job. And there was a small handful of guys that I could say where if I went to them with a question, or even if I said, hey, I think I screwed this up, they would say, cool, we'll fix it. It's okay. You made a mistake, but we can figure this out. It's not the end of the world. Absolutely. And even if but it took a certain type of supervisor for the employee to feel comfortable going to that sergeant and say, hey, I screwed up big time. What do we do? And there'd be a lot of employees who would try to figure it out themselves, try to bury it, or just otherwise let it go. And it's unfortunate because, when you have a sergeant, it's kind of like having a parent. You kind of have a couple of them sometimes, and you're going to go to the one that you get along with usually, and for the right reasons. And I think if more sergeants devoted time to doing that, or just sort of based on their experience. Personally, I see sergeants who promote and they do great things and they have confidence. They usually worked a different assignment, whether it was specialty unit, detective, something. They have this mental mindset, but also the experience to have the confidence to go, yeah, this is fine. We'll figure this out. Or if you have a really big call, they're the ones who are level-headed. They're not freaking out, calling lieutenants and captains in the middle. They're just solving problems. Yeah. And for the classes and stuff that you teach or anything, I always tell people, like, if you stop learning or you think that you know everything, then you've already failed.
That is so well stated there, Mac. The education doesn't stop just because you came to a training course. The education continues. We over at Savage Training Group try to give you the best necessary tools to ensure that, hey, if you get to a scene of a critical incident, these are we'll give you an acronym, something to think about for you to what we call nowadays command and control. And that is the biggest challenge that a sergeant has, whether you're a new sergeant or an old sergeant. Just keep thinking about command and control. And what we mean by command and control is when you're at a scene of a potential critical incident, or it is a critical incident, either or, you need to take complete command and control of that situation. You have to formulate a plan. You got to start guiding, directing, and ensuring that what you're doing is safe and the protection to ensure that they're not going to get hurt or killed. And so the burden is heavy on you, and you need to know how are you going to maneuver and I suppose uh, orchestrate, right?
Yeah.
Engineer
Yeah.
this particular scene, and that takes a lot. It takes a lot of confidence. It takes a lot of courage. But more than anything, it takes a lot of training. And if you're not having roll calls saying, you know what, today we're going to grab AB 392, dude. Okay, hey, 35 APC. We're going to do section C1 today, and let's talk about it. As a matter of fact, let's watch a video real quick and start breaking it down. You start talking about it a lot and it starts implementing in your mind. When you get that oh shit moment when you're rolling to that critical incident, you know what? You're going to at the very least have that confidence to have that incident command presence to ensure that you guys are being protected.
Yeah. I think that's huge. And I think that if most people would look at it from the perspective of just sort of, this is kind of a preemptive. We're studying for the what if, and someday it will happen to you. I always tell people we don't get to choose the moment. The moment will choose us. And
that's right.
If you are educating your guys, especially as a supervisor, and you're providing them with info, and your guys will read you like a book. If you're at a scene and you look like you don't know what you're doing, they're going to feed off that. They're going to vibe off that, and they're going to see, okay, great. That makes me feel really comfortable. I have a sergeant who doesn't know what they're doing. And even if the sergeant is honest, I can appreciate that too, where if they say, you know what, I don't know, but I'm going to get you an answer. Give me 10 minutes and I'm going to find out, I'm going to find an answer to this question, or I'm going to consult someone above me to try and figure this out. But in terms of, I think in California in particular, it's sad because we get all this training, but I still feel like it's not enough. And for the audience who doesn't know, talk a little bit about your training and what you guys offer.
Yeah, so over at Savage Training Group, we just, I think we're 4 or 5 years in, and Scott Savage has done a great job to hand select his instructors. I'm blessed to really hone in and focus on the fact that in a classroom, not only are you engaged, but we want you to walk away with nuggets. We want you to walk away with some educating tools for you to go back to your agency and teach our officers. And so, yeah, look us up, Savage Training Group. They offer really, really good, the majority of the courses, tactical conduct, how to respond to a non-critical incident. There is a class of a non-criminal barricade. So, for example, let's just say you have someone that suffers from mental illness and they happen to barricade themselves. It's not actually a SWAT call out. There is some protocols that you need to make a decision on. And, we start talking about tactical disengagement, the public duty doctrine. That's a great course to take if I were a young officer or a young sergeant. And of course, it's not so sexy to take an internal affairs course. I get it. We'll be in Modesto in the end of March. The class is almost filled up. But what you get out of our class is a lot of interaction, a lot of engagement. We teach you how to actually what we call cutting a face sheet, doing an IA, and we'll walk you through some do's and don'ts. Then we'll do some role playing in terms of investigating how to conduct a compelled interview. And last but not least, what we implemented in day one is the adjudication process. So let's just say you're in a small agency, you're a sergeant, your captain's on vacation, your lieutenant's on vacation. The chief just happens to walk by and says, hey, Mac, what's going on with that case with Johnson? And you're like, okay, well, why don't you come in my office and brief me? And when you're briefing me this case, I need to know whether it's sustained or unfounded. I pretty much would like to know, your take on this. And so we'll prepare you to, have those conversations and how to do an analysis of, look, what we're saying, the evidence shows that, yes, they did do this particular allegation. It did happen. So we're going to have to sustain it. In terms of penalty, that would totally be up to you, Chief. And, you can have that discussion. So that's what we do in day one. And day two, we just dive right into an officer-involved shooting, which I kind of covered a little bit. Anywhere from the time that you show up, from the time that you pull the trigger and everything that happens afterwards. My partner, James Tacchini, does a really good job to engage the course, and we break down 835 APC in a very effective manner, if you will. But yeah, there's other courses that you can take. But here's the offer: take some time and spend some money. And I'm sure the money that you're spending can be recovered by your union, right? So you pay up front, and I believe you can probably submit an invoice, and your union will probably cover it because it is police related training. And spend it well. You definitely, and here's the deal: you be honest with us. We're very transparent. Call our bullshit if you happen to hear something that we said that was wrong, or that you doesn't make sense, because we don't want you to walk away with anything that's unanswered. So we do a very, very good job to ensure that every single question that you have about this particular topic is being covered. So it's one of the reasons why I jumped on board with Savage Training Group. We do a very, very good job, and we spend a lot of time doing research. We touched on it earlier. Senate Bill 2 is a block of presentation that I do in day one, but hey, you know what? I'm going to go to that hearing so that way I can come back and let the students know, okay, I just went to a hearing, and here's how it's going to go down. And so, yeah, definitely look us up.
Awesome. Well, good. I always tell people, if you don't ask, you're not going to get it. So ask for training and put in the request. If it gets denied, try again in a couple months. If it gets tabled, it's one of those things where a lot of cops get discouraged because of, we can't afford it right now. We're going through budget cuts. There's a lot of free training out there, and there's tons of stuff you can do with the internet. You can look up all kinds of stuff. And it's interesting because I think that there's so much of an emphasis. We have this huge tactic. There's a gun channel for every single high port, low port, whatever. Pick a topic and you'll find an infinite amount, but there's so little on stuff like this, and especially what you guys do, where tactics are great, but the likelihood of you getting into a shooting, very slim. The likelihood of you getting in trouble, probable, by a very large margin. So you may as well do yourself the service of getting to know these internal workings. And IA, it's messy, but they could potentially someday save your career. So it does have that negative stigma. And I was even going to ask you before we started if you were recording this, but I don't think anyone would get that. But cop joke. So for the cops who are listening, they probably thought it was funny. But yeah, it's a job that I think if most people understood that was so important, so valuable, and when the right person is in that seat, it's awesome. But you get the wrong person in there, and all it takes is one guy or two guys, however big or small your agency is, to compromise that position and to create, a sort of volatile working environment for the employees. And it's scary, but that's a management issue. But
yeah, it is. Get the right person, have no expectations. And just remember this, in some parting words, before I actually forget, a lot of the guests, especially one in particular, said it best. And we've already done close to about 20 plus episodes. But one of the guests said it best. You know what? It's the punishment is not the penalty. That's what he actually said. The penalty, for the most part, the department gets it right. The levels of review, it's pretty reasonable. But you know what? It's the process that's the penalty. And that is so, so true. I describe the podcast as rich in content. It is super, super rich because you're hearing from so many different lenses. I have command staff officers talking about the adjudication process. I have accused employees saying, hey, you know what? I did something wrong and I got suspended and look at me now. I have others that come in and say, you know what? The department screwed up, but look at what they put me through. And I'm getting ready to actually have a guest who had an encounter with the police, and he attempted to get a hold of internal affairs, and it just went sideways on him. So I want to be fair for every lens.
Oh yeah, that perspective is so important.
Those are lessons learned as well. But for the most part, I have a guest that's coming in soon that was actually terminated twice by a real small agency. And you know what?
Double tapper.
He was a double tapper, and he actually got his
Yeah.
job back, and he's there right now.
Wow.
And
It happens.
he asked permission from the chief, and they're buddies. They're actually close, and they in the department, when this happened, the people who were involved in his adjudication process are not there. But the chief remembers him, and this happened over 10 years ago. And he knows that, you know what, we should be held accountable for what we did to you, and gave him permission to come on the show to actually share his experience. And it's going to be an episode where, you know what, you might want to think about treating people the way they are, which is why internal affairs gets such a bad reputation. And I'm here to tell you, Mac, and whoever's listening, that it's not that we're all bad. It's like you said, you need to pick someone who doesn't have any expectations and it's got good character. And they're just going to go wherever the facts or wherever the evidence leads them. But
no agenda.
Like the good old saying, right? No stone goes unturned. And that's your job. That is actually your duties and responsibilities. And don't forget about that. It doesn't matter how minor of it is. Just do right, not just by the officer, by the community as well. And 9 times out of 10, you know this, they probably saw things completely different. And the ones that stand out the most is those third parties. Oh, well, I saw officers do this. Okay, well, let's go check body worn video. That's not exactly how it went down, Mr., Mrs., the way you described it. And, potentially or eventually they go away, right?
Yeah, it's too bad. That's a game that is so just taxing and thinking about the employee. And if they're off for a certain period of time, I had a coworker and friend of mine who was in an IA for about, it was a long time. His marriage suffered, his mental health suffered, ended up being totally fine. But if you asked him, hey, like, do you think that, went down correctly? He would tell you, no, absolutely not. It was a witch hunt from the beginning. It was a fishing trip. And, my ultimately ended up being okay, but I think he's going to have a certain part of his brain and his heart that's going to hold the agency in bad light till the day he dies. And that's just the way it is. But it's unfortunate, but like you said, the right man for the job is everything. And I think this is a good place to call it. I do want you to let the audience know how they can get a hold of you, the socials, and any other way they can interact with you.
Yeah, Mac, for sure. So definitely on Instagram, my internal affairs podcast page. It's internal, I think it's internal_affairs podcast. The minute you pull that up, all the reels are there for all the episodes. Get a hold of me in LinkedIn, Marlon Marrache, Marlon, last name Marrache, Marrache. And last but not least, please go and subscribe to YouTube, Internal Affairs, a Police podcast. It's really, we've gotten so good feedback because it's just, it's pretty unique content. And don't forget
I forgot
to
his
subscribe.
name, but I can subscribe. It does help us. The guy with the beard, that was a wild episode. The LAPD retired. Yeah, that was cool. There was some good
Alan's
stories
good dude. I'm reaching to, you're going to hear a lot of LAPD stories. I am an LAPD alum. And, I'm blessed to have left a good reputation. Not only was I in internal affairs, but I was on the other side, and I was very fair and reasonable. And, I'm very sociable, and I'm a sweetheart. And a lot of my partners and people who I work for have come on the job to share their experience. And that is super, super important. And if you know anyone, whoever's listening, if you want to share your IA story, just as long as you tell yourself, hey, there's a lot that the audience can learn, and there's a lot of takeaways, because you never know who's watching and listening. Just like your podcast, you just never know. Someone's listening, saying, you know what, I want to get into this awesome profession that you and I both did, me 25 years ago, and you in 2010. And you know what, it's great. And by no means am I saying it's bad. It's just, there's a lot for you to think about, but it's awesome. And I've been blessed with a really, it has afforded me a lot of success. And thank you for having me, Mac. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, guys, this wraps up the episode. Marlon Marlon, thank you again. And we'll be back next week. I have a couple more. I'm probably going to do maybe 4 or 5 for the California Dreamin' series, just to kind of show some perspective on the state we live in. And I think Marlon shares my sincere appreciation for this place. I love California, but there's a lot of work that we have to do before it gets better. So again, Marlon, thank you. And we'll see you guys back here next week. Be safe.
Thanks, brother.